Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is our introductory lecture to understanding history, particularly for a world history or a European history or a East Asian history course. Many of the themes that we'll be looking at in this, including historiography, source interpretation, and historical themes, are applicable really to virtually any course that you might be taking. First question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do we study history? History, we tend to think it means simply our understanding of the past, knowledge of the facts of the past. In fact, that is incorrect. Historia is a Greek word that simply means to inquire. Literally, we could say it means to research. And so, therefore, like the scientific method, history uses data, mostly sources, mostly document sources, written records of the past, upon which we base our answer to relevant questions. And that's really what's critical, is that we ask ourselves a question, we go through the process of historical inquiry, and we come up with an answer. As a result of that, conclusions will vary based upon what questions a historian asks. So if a historian asks a simple question like what caused World War II, there will be a series of answers that many historians will say, well, this was one important cause. Another historian will emphasize another important cause. And it's a question of why they consider one cause or another to be the most important, to be the most relevant for starting the Second World War. As a result, historical study really helps us appreciate multiple perspectives and interpretations. And that's what's really critical about, in terms of being a 21st century citizen, is with so much information out there accessible to you via the internet, being able to sort through it relatively quickly, and with a good academic eye to understand what is a credible source, what's not a credible source, and base your own conclusions come to your own conclusions based upon that material. That's really what a good history student is going to be able to do, and then apply those skills to virtually anything. You don't have to study history your entire life, but so long as you use those skills, you'll be set in any number of fields. By digging deeply, we learn to appreciate the way social, political, and economic problems have been solved in the past, and that better helps us solve the kinds of issues, the critical issues that we face today. We may not solve the problem of poverty or health care in the same way that folks did in the 19th century, but we can certainly look at the types of things that they did and perhaps implement something similar, an updated version of that. How was that critical thinking or thinking outside of the box in the 19th century? What would that look like today? So much of history is about skill development, close analytical reading of historical and literary texts, both historical monographs, what historians write about a given topic, the questions they ask. Also, literature, not fictional literature, can actually help us understand what animated a society, what ideas concerned them. So, for instance, if you read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is a wonderful work of literature to give you an insight in terms of uh, the social, religious, economic conditions of the late Middle Ages in England. What types of themes emerge in that work of literature that give you an insight as to what people think, what people could connect to, or in some cases, what elites, people who are at the top end of society, people who are living in the royal courts, things like that, what they thought was important. Okay? Another important skill is interpreting and evaluating compilations of data. This is sort of, again, sort of like what you do in a science class. You conduct an experiment, you gather data from that experiment. Now you have to make sense of that data, and you write a lab report. Another important thing we do is we develop our insights, we develop our impressions, and we develop arguments based on what we've researched. Okay? Based upon what you've studied, what you've discovered, what you've found on a given topic, you're going to put it together and you're going to say, okay, this is what happened, this is why it happened. And you're going to use that data to support those statements that you make, those statements of your educated opinion, in essence. You will articulate, in a history course, you will articulate these insights in many different ways. One of them is going to be an academic style, which is writing essays and writing papers. Right? That's the traditional way in which you say, this is my educated opinion, here is the data that supports that, my insight as to what happened in this historical period. There's another way to do that, and that is through technological platforms. The kind of PowerPoint and recording that I'm doing here now, you could easily modify to argue why you think the current conflict with ISIS needs to change. The U.S. response to the current situation in the Middle East needs to change. And you can do a PowerPoint presentation, and you can bring in data to support your views, and you can put it together, and you can make a screen capture, and you could post this to YouTube. Okay? That's another way, that's a contemporary technological platform by which you can express your insights. We're also here to apply our understanding of the past to inform our engagement with the contemporary world. So if, let's say, you did that, why the U.S. should change its strategy in the Middle East, there might be some history, some relevant pieces of information that, maybe go back to the British strategy in Iraq and Palestine in the period after World War I, and the kind of early terrorism that they faced then in terms of dealing with the issues now. Okay? Or what does it mean that these people are advocating for a caliphate? What is a caliphate? What does that mean in the history of Islam? We learn to appreciate and critique the various cultural expressions of other civilizations. That's really critical, that we make sure that we suspend a judgment that's purely based upon our own upbringing, just by fact of being living in the United States and so forth, and the Western cultural tradition. And we learn to appreciate how other civilizations see the world, understand the world, and therefore act according to those understandings. At a certain point in time, though, it is appropriate for a general critique to be made. But that's very careful at how we do that in a respectful way. So we must be mindful of that. We also develop creative and problem-solving skills necessary in any academic practical pursuit. So really, historians are it's about investigating something, it's about looking at data, it's about trying to figure out why something happened, putting it together, and then even in some cases proposing some kind of solution for a relevant contemporary topic. And you don't have to do this in history. You do this in science. You can do this in mathematics. You do this in engineering. You can do this in anthropology. There's any number of fields in which these skills will be applied. One last very theoretical question is historiography. It's like the story about how we tell history. It's a little complicated. It's very theoretical. But there are different ways different groups of historians over the past have told the history. You will have historians, groups of historians who in the 1950s and 60s really advocated very social and economic type history. History is about social groups, and it's about poverty or wealth. History is about rich and poor. Earlier historians would have emphasized sort of elites and wars and politics and kings and queens and the inner workings of governments. Today, we tend to blend a lot of those issues much more. So different groups of historians tackle the questions with a different methodology. Some historical schools really, really like to pile on the data. All right, you have to, lots and lots of statistics. Their books are filled with charts and graphs of data. That's called the analyst school that started in the 20s and 30s in France. All right. You have the Marxists who tell history according to the political and economic theories of the mid-19th century economic philosopher Karl Marx. And their histories are always about class struggle and warfare between rich and poor and the people who own businesses and so forth, and the workers and so forth. This really can highlight it in maybe something that you might be familiar with, and that is um, um, the American Revolution. You know. And we're going to do a little exercise that asks the question, what is the American Revolution? How did you learn it? Did you learn it as a revolutionary war? Well, what was so revolutionary about it? What is a revolution? Once you define a revolution, is the American Revolution truly a revolution? Is it a war for independence? Is that too simplistic? Is it more revolutionary than simply an independence movement? What's going on in colonial America? And then finally, there's another school that could even argue that it was a civil war within the British Empire, in which the rebels, the Americans, established their own nation as a result of it. But ideologically, politically, everyone was very British. It was British people fighting British people over British ideals. So that's where, and that's an important question for us as Americans. How do we understand our own history? Okay, and based upon the assumptions that you make about history, that will color how you understand the present and the solutions that you create for the future. So this is just a general overview of why we study history, some of the big themes in history, the skills associated with it. In the next series of lectures, we'll be looking at sources and other major themes in historical study. For now, however, thank you for listening.